In 2026, India will discover something uncomfortable. That foreign policy is no longer something you manage abroad, while politics and growth are handled at home. The walls are coming down. For years, New Delhi could absorb diplomatic setbacks and still point to elections won, reforms passed, growth numbers delivered. But this time is different, because when tariffs rise, supply chains shift, and alliances cool, the effects don't stay in Washington or Brussels. They land directly in factories, markets, and voting booths. I want you to hold on to one idea as we begin. What happens to India's place in the world is about to shape daily life inside the country in ways we haven't seen before. Not symbolically, structurally. If you care about where India is headed economically, politically, geopolitically, this story matters to you. Stay with me. Because to understand 2026, we first need to understand why 2025 quietly set the stage for everything that follows. And that's where we begin next. To see why 2026 will feel so different, we have to slow down and look clearly at what actually broke in 2025. On the surface, India appeared resilient. Growth remained strong. Elections were won. Trade deals were signed. But beneath that stability, pressure was building across three fronts at once: diplomacy, economics, and regional security. A short conflict with Pakistan exposed how fragile deterrence remains. Relations with Washington deteriorated just as India needed strategic trust the most. 50% U.S. tariffs, tied to Russian oil purchases, and a failed trade deadline were not just a trade dispute, they were a signal. At the same time, instability spread across India's neighborhood. From Nepal's protests to the political rupture in Bangladesh, the government tried to separate these external shocks from domestic performance. That separation is now collapsing. Because tariffs do not stay at borders, sanctions risks do not remain theoretical, and regional instability does not respect electoral calendars. To understand how these pressures converged, we need to step back into the longer history and structural logic that brought India to this moment. To understand why these pressures are converging now, you have to look beyond individual events and see the cycle India is caught in. For 2 decades, India's rise was built on a simple logic. Globalization would stay open, strategic autonomy would allow flexibility, and growth at home would cushion shocks abroad. That model worked until the world changed faster than India's assumptions. Great powers are no longer just competing militarily. They are weaponizing trade, technology, and supply chains. Tariffs are no longer economic tools. They are instruments of alignment, and neutrality has become harder to sustain. India's bet was that its size, market, and democratic credentials would make it indispensable, that it could de-risk from China without fully choosing sides. But as the US-China rivalry hardened, ambiguity lost value. At the same time, India's growth model leaned heavily on domestic demand and incremental reform, not deep integration into advanced manufacturing ecosystems. That left it exposed when trade conditions shifted suddenly. This is the structural backdrop to 2025, and why the shocks that followed carried more weight than they first appeared. Because once a cycle turns, events stop being isolated. They begin to compound. And the first real rupture came faster than expected. The rupture arrived in May, fast, sharp, and revealing. A 4-day conflict with Pakistan didn't spiral into full war. That was the relief. But the lesson ran deeper. Strategic restraint held, not because tensions disappeared, but because escalation had become too dangerous to control. Nuclear weapons, external pressure, and global scrutiny forced both sides to step back. Yet restraint is not stability. It is suspension. Almost immediately after, another shock followed, quieter, but far more consequential. Washington imposed 50% tariffs on India. The trigger was narrow: Russian crude purchases and a missed trade deadline. The message was not, this was leverage, applied openly. If you want strategic autonomy, the US was saying, you will pay for it. This moment mattered because it exposed a vulnerability India had long tried to manage invisibly. Security pressure on one flank, economic pressure on another, and limited room to respond forcefully on either. If you're watching closely, this is where confidence begins to crack. Not publicly, but systemically. And once pressure enters the system, it doesn't stay contained. It searches for weak points. That search had only just begun. What comes next is not a single decision or a single failure. It's a mechanism, quiet, structural, and deeply constraining. India's foreign policy rests on a belief in strategic autonomy, the ability to engage everyone, align with no one fully, and keep options open. For years, that flexibility was an asset. Today, it's under stress. Because the global system is no longer neutral toward ambiguity. The United States increasingly prefers predictable partners over balancing ones. Access to markets, technology, and supply chains is now conditional, not declared, but enforced. India felt this most clearly in what didn't happen. Exclusion from the Trump administration's Pax Silica Summit on critical and emerging technologies was not symbolic. It was practical. It signaled that India was no longer assumed to be central in shaping the next technological order. This isn't about punishment. It's about prioritization. Even as U.S. tech companies announce investments, much of it flows into data centers, not into the advanced manufacturing India needs to anchor itself in global supply chains. Semiconductors reveal the gap. India designs chips, but produces mainly less advanced ones, constrained by water, power, and infrastructure. This is the hidden mechanism at work. Autonomy without integration slowly erodes influence. And once influence slips, pressure accelerates. Which brings us to the second surge. The second surge didn't come as a crisis headline. It came as a delay, and delays can be more dangerous than shocks. India's strongest defense against U.S. tariffs was supposed to be trade diversion, new markets, new partners, new momentum. And at the center of that strategy sat one deal above all others, the European Union. But negotiations that began in 2007 stalled again. A self-imposed deadline passed, and with it, the hope of quickly offsetting American pressure. Meanwhile, Washington began discussing additional sanctions on countries doing business with Russia, a threat that hovered over India's energy strategy like a cloud. This is where timing matters. The strongest GDP figures were recorded before the full force of tariffs hit. Their real impact arrives later gradually, invisibly through slower exports, squeezed margins, and investor hesitation. And that economic drag does not arrive in isolation. In 2026, India heads into elections across 4 states and 1 union territory. Growth narratives weaken. External pressure becomes domestic vulnerability. Suddenly, foreign policy choices show up in local politics. This is the second surge, when economic stress begins to translate into political exposure. And that's when systems become personal. This is the point where the story stops being abstract and starts to involve you. Because when tariffs bite and deals stall, the impact doesn't arrive as a headline. It arrives quietly, in prices, in jobs, in uncertainty. You may not follow trade negotiations, but you feel their consequences. If growth slows, governments have fewer choices. Welfare becomes harder to fund. Infrastructure spending tightens. Private investment hesitates. And for millions of households, stability begins to feel conditional. You are told the economy is resilient, and in many ways, it is. But resilience is not immunity. External pressure tests the margins. First, small manufacturers, exporters, informal workers, before it reaches the center. This is why 2026 matters politically. Elections are no longer fought only on identity or ideology. They are fought on confidence, on whether people believe the system is still working for them. This is also where foreign policy loses its distance. Decisions made to balance powers abroad start shaping expectations at home. If this analysis resonates with you, don't disengage. Understanding these linkages is the first step toward clarity, because what happens next goes far beyond India's borders. Once domestic pressure builds, its effects don't stop at national borders. They ripple outward. India is not just another large economy. It sits at the crossroads of multiple global fault lines: trade, technology, energy, and geopolitics. When India recalibrates, others feel it. In 2026, the world will be watching India's summit diplomacy closely. Hosting the AI Impact Summit, the BRICS Summit, and possibly the Quad Summit is not ceremonial. It's strategic signaling. Who shows up? who stays away, and what language is used will reveal where India truly stands. Visits from leaders like Ursula von der Leyen and Antonio Costa signal Europe's interest in anchoring India more firmly into its economic orbit. A potential visit by Xi Jinping would test regional pragmatism, and a possible Trump visit would hinge on whether India and the US can repair trust and secure a trade deal. But here is the tension. Visibility does not equal influence. Being present at summits is not the same as shaping outcomes. India wants to be seen as indispensable, a bridge between blocs, a voice of the global south, a stabilizing force. Yet exclusion from initiatives like Pax Silica suggests others are making decisions without waiting for New Delhi. This is the global impact, a world where India is invited everywhere, but centered nowhere. And that raises the hardest question of all: what happens next? What happens next depends on choices and constraints. And in 2026, India faces three possible futures, none of them abstract. The first is managed convergence. India secures a trade deal with the European Union. Tensions with Washington ease. Tariffs are reduced, not eliminated. Strategic autonomy survives, but in a narrower form. India accepts selective alignment in technology and supply chains, while preserving diplomatic flexibility elsewhere. Growth slows, but remains politically manageable. This is the best-case outcome: stability without surrender. The second is prolonged balancing. No major trade breakthroughs. U.S. tariffs stay. Sanctions risk lingers. India hosts summits, issues statements, and avoids confrontation. Growth holds, but weakens. Foreign policy becomes cautious, almost defensive. Strategic autonomy remains intact but increasingly hollow. This is survival, not momentum. The third is systemic squeeze. Trade talks fail, sanctions expand, regional tensions flare again. Economic pressure deepens just as political cycles intensify. Strategic autonomy turns from asset to liability. India is forced to react rather than shape. This is where accidents matter, where miscalculations carry outsized costs. None of these futures is predetermined, but all are constrained by the same reality. The world is less tolerant of ambiguity than it once was. And that brings us to the final insight, the one that ties everything together. What 2026 ultimately reveals is not a failure of ambition, but a test of coherence. India wants growth, autonomy, influence, and stability. Each goal is rational on its own. The challenge is that the global system is no longer designed to let countries pursue all of them simultaneously without trade-offs. For years, India mastered the art of balancing, saying little, moving carefully, keeping doors open. That strategy delivered space, but space is shrinking. Today, silence is read as hesitation, neutrality is read as distance, and autonomy is questioned when it avoids commitment. The real insight is this: foreign policy is no longer foreign. It shapes jobs, prices, elections, and trust at home. And domestic politics now feeds directly back into India's global credibility. If you want to understand where India goes next, don't just watch summits or statements. Watch trade deals. Watch technology access. Watch how much room India actually has to choose. Because the next phase of India's rise will not be about balancing powers. It will be about deciding what kind of power India wants to be. If this analysis helped you see the system more clearly, stay with this channel. The next video goes deeper into what strategic autonomy really costs in a divided world.